Welcome to the show on faith and culture and much more. Philip Lawler is our guest. He's the editor of Catholic World News and the author of The Faithful Departed. For many years, he was the editor of Catholic World Report and was a candidate for the U.S. Senate in the year 2000. He's now the program director for the Center for the Restoration of Christian Culture at St. Thomas More College in beautiful New Hampshire. His latest book that we'll be digging in today is titled Lost Shepherd, How Pope Francis is Misleading His Flock. Philip Lawler, thank you for joining me. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Maybe we should make it clear at the outset that this is, I find that as a reader and as a raised, rebelled, returned Catholic, difficult book to read. It's a difficult conversation to have because Catholics instinctively love their popes. Would you agree that in some sense it doesn't matter which man occupies the office, that Jesus Christ has promised His Holy Spirit to work in a particular way through His vicars, and this concern over some of the Holy Father's decisions and pronouncements is not a disrespect to His office, and I just want to kind of lay a groundwork that Catholics really shouldn't be fundamentally anxious about some of the things we'll be talking about today.
No, well, you've given me a whole lot of implicit questions there. You said it was a difficult book to read. It was a difficult book to write, and it's one I didn't particularly want to write. Mm-hmm. But the reason I wrote it was partly because I found that as I said things critical of some things that Pope Francis has said, the response from my readers was relief. And it was relief because they were thinking, my gosh, what the Pope is saying doesn't match up with what I think about the Catholic faith, what I've been taught. It seems something is out of sync here. What is it? Am I crazy? Is the Catholic faith changing? And my response to them essentially is, no, you're not crazy. No, the faith is not changing. What's happening is that the Pope is saying some confusing things. And the proper response to confusion is not anger or panic, it's clarity. Mm-hmm. What we really need is to reestablish that clarity about what the Church teaches.
Yeah, I sensed a spirit of wincing as I was reading the book. Like you don't want to bring up so many examples, but the more you dig, the more examples appear where the Holy Father has said things that are either ambiguous or seemingly at variance with what previous popes have taught about fundamental things. Like, take for example one of the more high-profile examples, the Apostolic Exhortation Amoris Laetitia, and with respect to Holy Communion for divorced and remarried Catholics. There are just so many decisions that you look at, and it doesn't seem to jibe with what Catholics who've been Catholics for decades came to expect from previous Holy Fathers. The personnel changes and the priorities exercised that way, and also I say apparent because I never know what the definitive answer is, an apparent comfortability with ambiguity in so many of the documents and off-the-cuff speeches and remarks.
That's right. Well, you said earlier that it doesn't matter who occupies the chair of Peter. In one sense, it doesn't, in the sense that whoever it is, we owe him our fidelity and our respect and our prayers. It does matter for the good of the Church because some popes are just much better teachers and leaders than others. And let's face it, we have been spoiled for decades, those of us around our age, by two brilliant, saintly popes who also happen to be world-class intellectuals and were terrific teachers. And even before Pope Francis was elected, I was warning people, we can't expect more of this. There isn't more of it to be had. There isn't another Benedict waiting in the wings. What we can expect, though, is clarity and consistency with past Church teachings, and that has been lacking frequently with Pope Francis. I mean, you mentioned the most obvious example in Amoris Laetitia, where the difficulty is not that the Pope seems to simply to be at variance with previous Church teaching. That's not just any Church teaching. It's Church teaching that is founded on the clear words of our Lord Jesus himself, not something that's up for grabs. And when you are creating confusion on issues as fundamental as marriage and the Eucharist, well, it's difficult to find any two issues more central to what it means to be a Catholic.
Regarding number 8 and the controversial footnotes, Phil, I want to get your take on some bishops. I'm thinking of Cardinal Worrell, who have launched initiatives at the diocesan level to implement the teaching of Amoris Laetitia in a pastoral setting on the ground with married couples and with priests. I don't remember any similar programs regarding Humanae Vitae, how to integrate that, or Familiaris Consortio. So this is kind of a rhetorical question. Maybe I'll toss it out and you can knock it around or ignore it. But if Amoris Laetitia is said to be clear and there's no need for, say, Cardinals' dubia to be answered, then why do initiatives need to be brought forth to explain the norms if the norms haven't changed? Does that question make sense?
Well, it makes sense as a rhetorical question, but don't ask me to answer it because there is no satisfactory answer. I mean, Amoris Laetitia is not clear, and the lack of clarity is very evident in the fact that you have different bishops and conferences of bishops issuing guidelines that are clearly contradictory. And I mean, they can't both be right in their interpretation. Mm-hmm. Now, Pope Francis himself has said that the Argentine bishop's interpretation was the correct one, and he said there is no other. Well, first of all, as a matter of fact, there are others. That's a matter of fact. There are other contradictory interpretations. And secondly, while the Pope can preach with authority, I don't think he can delegate that authority, put it in footnotes, or use it by indirection. I mean, the authority of the Pope, particularly when he speaks in his capacity from the seat of Peter, mm-hmm. that authority is to clarify, not to obfuscate.
How is it significant that he elevated that letter to the Argentine bishops into the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, the kind of official organ of papal teaching? Because that seems to be significant.
It is significant. It is clearly an effort to make it authoritative. But again, you can't be authoritative if you're not clear. What is it that you're saying authoritatively? If it's not clear to me what you're saying authoritatively, then you can't say it's authoritative.
Yeah, so then you can't really double down on the authority side because the truth behind it is not sufficiently established. That's what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. I remember what I was doing when I learned that Pope Benedict was abdicating. You point out in the book that lightning hit St. Peter's twice that day when he announced his abdication, rather casually at a consistory for, I think it was a canonization of some new saints. Mm-hmm. And he just kind of laid in, by the way, I'm out of here. I remember seeing the footage thinking, boy, this is very strange. That's when I began to be dizzy. And then we have Cardinal Bergoglio, who chose Francis. I think that's the first non-numeraled Holy Father in hundreds of years. Is that true, Phil?
Well, unless you call John Paul I, but that's, he was explicitly naming him, taking the names of the two previous popes.
The two previous popes, right. And then,
it's been centuries, I think, before anyone else.
I really wasn't sure what to make of the new Holy Father, but I liked the first couple of moves that he made. I liked the emphasis on getting outside the comfort zone of the parish. I liked the energy that he seemed to provide. There was he was on every news feed, on the cover of every newspaper in the first year, and frankly, I thought this is the guy to reform all the things that the previous Holy Father, now Pope Emeritus Benedict, couldn't because of infirmity or age or he just wasn't up for it as a German scholar. And I thought maybe Pope Francis will be able to implement these reforms and really energize the church. And like you, things began to sound a little bit odd. And then I read his first apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, and I liked a lot of it. I thought, that's beautiful. That needs to be said. I'm glad he wrote that. But then there were other things, like Islam as a religion of peace, and anything other than a peaceful premise does not belong to the teaching of Islam. Then I thought, well, the Holy Father's straying away from his role as vicar of Christ, pronouncing on the teachings of other world religions. That was the first domino in my mind where I began to analyze what exactly the Francis effect really is.
Interesting. I had the same sort of reaction as you know. I was very enthusiastic at first. To me, when Pope Francis came out and started talking about how we need to get away from the image of the what he called the self-referential church,
Mm-hmm.
that to me that was music to my ears
Yep.
because that's something that I've been trying to express myself. That so many of our problems come from being wrapped up in ourselves, in our institutional concerns, and not being evangelical. And he did seem to have a tremendous amount of evangelical energy, and it resonated with a lot of people. I was running into friends who never had shown any interest in the faith before, and suddenly were very interested indeed.
Mm-hmm.
So that was all very exciting. I have to say that over time, that excitement has sort of petered out. And now I'm not hearing much from those friends about the faith. They've gone back to know what is for them normal.
Right.
The crowds in St. Peter's Square are not record-breaking anymore. In fact, they're quite small. And it's too bad because it has the feel of a lost opportunity to me. You mentioned that you thought Pope Francis might be the one to clean up the mess because there was a general perception things were a mess, that Pope John Paul and particularly Pope Benedict, for all the good things about them, they were not great administrators. And we needed a general house cleaning at the Vatican, and I thought that would happen. Well, it hasn't happened, quite the contrary.
Deft use of the metaphor petered out, Philip. Very good. What was the genesis of the book? At what point did you realize I have to catalog these things and help people make sense of them? Was there one kind of dropping of the glove where you just had to speak up at the risk of appearing like someone who was undermining your own pope?
Yes, it was just a little over a year ago. I posted a column with the deliberately provocative title, "This Disastrous Papacy." Something had snapped in me that day, hearing what the Pope had said. I think it was in one of his homilies at a daily mass. And that was a point at which I said, I can no longer pretend to reconcile what I'm hearing with what I've been taught for all of my years up till now, and I'm going to speak out. And the reaction to that short essay, was it generated more reaction than anything else I've ever written. And the comments that came pouring in, somewhat to my surprise, were mostly favorable. Mm-hmm. And even more satisfying to me was that they were saying what I'd said earlier about a feeling of relief, that A, I'm glad somebody's saying it, and B, this is actually helping me to calm down, to recognize, okay, we have a problem with the Pope. It's not a problem with the faith. It's not a problem with my sanity. It's a problem with the Pope, who is giving the church some uncertain leadership. Well, we've had bad popes in the past, and we've survived. And we'll survive this. So this is an alternative, really, because, there are an awful lot of people out there, as I know you know, who are much more extreme, who are ready to say this is the anti-pope, this is the end of the world, or that he's not the legitimate pope, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
It's time to calm down. That's not the problem. The problem is the Pope is confusing people, and we need to remedy that confusion.
Yeah, maybe the follow-up to this disastrous papacy would be, everybody, back on decaf. It's going to be okay.
Right.
So let me pick up something that you allude to in the book, and that is the theory that Pope Francis is not the real Pope. And the basis for this claim, which I don't believe. In fact, I don't really know how to find out the facts on this. But Austin Ivory, in his warm biography, The Great Reformer, which came out about a year after the Holy Father became Pope, and I'm not sure how much he reformed at that point. But anyway, in that book, there's an anecdote told very casually about a group of cardinals from the, say, northwestern part of Europe who met after the death of John Paul II to kind of create a voting bloc to get Cardinal Bergoglio elected, and of course it didn't work. We had Joseph Ratzinger on the chair of Peter. And then they met again and met with Cardinal Bergoglio. This is all in the book. And kind of got his assent. Well, as soon as that book came out, the now late Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor said that thing didn't happen. There were no dinners. There was no meeting place. There was no voting bloc conspiracy, so to speak. And it became evident that John Paul II had wrote something, I think it was a motu proprio. I'm going to put it in the show notes at patrickhoffman.media, indicating that canonically, voting members of a papal conclave cannot do that. You can't create a kind of lobby group and kind of do some backroom deals to get the guy that you want. And if you do that, then it's a late sententia excommunication. I'm sure you've heard that theory. I wanted to get your take
Sure.
on.
Yes.
Well, that would explain a lot of stuff if he's actually not the real pope and the chair has actually been empty for 5 years.
Yes, it would, but you have to really work at it to get there. First of all, if you say, let's say for the sake of the argument, that some of these cardinals drew upon themselves the penalty of excommunication. It's a secret ballot, so we don't know who they voted for. So how do you discount their votes? I mean, you would have to invalidate the whole election and go back and start over. Mm-hmm. But secondly, we don't know exactly what happened with that group of liberal or progressive cardinals. It's very clear to me there was such a group. They did get together. Whether they got together explicitly for the purpose of lobbying for a papal election is unclear. Mm-hmm. If it's a group of cardinals who got together to talk about what they thought was for the good of the church, I expect that's something that happens quite frequently. So, I mean, I think it's a little foolish to act as if this is all perfectly obvious. Mm-hmm. I mean, there is a pope. He was elected. Nobody who was at the election thinks otherwise.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the ironies of the phenomena of Pope Francis's off-the-cuff comments, which are now, they just seem to become fast and furious, is that when he flew from Rome to Rio de Janeiro for World Youth Day a couple of years ago, you probably remember this, he was talking with a journalist about how he doesn't really like journalism interviews. He doesn't do them, they give him a headache. And it was the flight back that gave us Who Am I to Judge Him and the gay lobby. And that seemed to have opened the floodgates to almost constant interviews with people like Eugenio Scalfari, a 90-year-old atheist of editor of La Repubblica in Italy. That was like an 18-wheeler turning on a dime. I don't like interviews, and then wall-to-wall interviews.
That's right, and it's really one of the things I don't understand. I had seen that. I was co-author of a biography of Pope Francis, one of these quickie books right after his election. And I came across that when he was in Buenos Aires, he was saying he didn't like interviews, and if you wanted to know what he thought, better to read his homilies.
Right.
And yet now he's been interviewed left, right, and center, and including, as you say, by a man, Scalfari, who's apparently misquoted him a couple of times, or we don't know for sure, because the man doesn't take notes of his interviews. He relies on his own memory, which, I mean, if you were a PR man for the Pope, I don't think you'd allow that. If you're going to interview the Pope, I want a recording. I want to have his words, not your idea of his words.
Right. Yeah, and then Father Lombardi would be trundled out to domesticate the problematic areas, but then he would say some very flattering things about the overall tone, that he basically gets it right. It leaves ordinary folks like me scratching my head. Which part of this interview reflects the Catholic faith, and which is the Pope's personal opinion, and which is Scalfari's spin on what the Pope may or may not have said?
We just don't know, which is why it's so amazing to me that there are 2 or perhaps 3 of these interviews. And they are, as you say, among many interviews that have been coming out, not just on airplanes, although the airplane interviews seem to be the time when he's most likely to drop a bomb.
Holy Fathers are always going to be in the target of the world's media, our Lord Jesus Christ is the sign of contradiction. So certainly anyone who identifies as a Christian in any leadership position is going to have a target on their back. So there's this built-in vulnerability to being misunderstood and, calumniated and so on. I wanted to ask you about the "Who am I to judge," which became a kind of a floating slogan. It's taken up by the LGTB movement as a kind of validation. See, the Pope's kind of like our mascot. Who are you to judge? And therefore, an indictment of Catholics who believe the fullness of the gospel. In the case of Pope Francis's statements, however, there's that comfortability with ambiguity again that seems to open itself up to more and needless misinterpretation. Because he did not say the words, "Who am I to judge?" Right? You lay the context out in your book.
Yes, but I mean, it was in context. It was fairly predictable that journalists would take from it what they did indeed take from it. Mm-hmm. And "Who am I to judge" was pretty much an accurate reading of what everyone thought he was saying. Mm-hmm. And that did disturb. I think they're the most famous words of this pontificate, and they are among the most disturbing because who are you to judge? Well, actually, you're the Roman pontiff. You're sort of in the judging business, not judging the individual, but judging the action. And this was with reference to a prelate whose actions had been documented and could be judged. And it just seemed like opening the floodgates.
It's interesting how every pontificate comes to be summarized by a single line. I'm thinking John Paul II's, the what they call the first sentence of the obituary. Be not afraid. When I think John Paul II, if you had to put it in one phrase, with Pope Benedict possibly hermeneutic of continuity or dictatorship of relativism, a very kind of rich, resonant idea. And I think you're right. I think "Who am I to judge" may be the Holy Father's summarized tagline.
That's sort of a frightening thought. I mean, there's time left, and that's one of the reasons that we should continue to pray for the Holy Father, that he is able to clarify his thinking and our thinking. Mm-hmm. And there's no reason why he can't do that.
Let's move to Laudate Si, the encyclical, which has again been misinterpreted, much maligned, possibly mostly unread, like Humanae Vitae. It's not just about climate change or global warming, although that's kind of a sub-theme. In that encyclical, the Holy Father, and I'm going to use the word seems to enshrine an either controversial or at least debated point of science and elevated that into Catholic doctrine with respect to this climate change movement. Is any Roman pontiff qualified to adjudicate on questions of science that scientists themselves are still working out?
No, obviously not. I mean, the Pope has authority, and other bishops have authority to speak on questions of faith and morals. When they speak on other subjects, their authority is no greater or less than whatever you want to attach to it, whatever personal expertise they may have. And popes are not experts on science, climate change, economics, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the economics one, that gets into that impinges on Catholic social teaching, and there's so much to be said about the Holy Father's own upbringing in Argentina and his experience with economics. I believe he said in an interview that he was far from an expert in economics. He didn't really understand much about it. It seems that he didn't have an upbringing in which a full and robust free market economy was chugging along with great success. I mean, Argentina has been convulsed by revolutions and government corruption and so on. And so it's almost you wouldn't expect him to weigh in affectionately or appreciatively with what Americans are used to thinking of as a sound economic policy or a sound system.
Right.
Even if you don't mean laissez-faire capitalism.
To keep things in perspective, I should confess that when Pope Benedict spoke about economics, he made me nervous too, because I thought he, frankly, didn't care enough about the study of economics to immerse himself in it.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think that he was much more careful about observing a distinction between what he taught in terms of Catholic social teaching as setting forth the principles from which you should build your economic system. That is to say, uh, it is possible to say that a Catholic should adhere to the principles of subsidiarity and solidarity and should make this the individual rather than the profit motive the center of his own moral reasoning, economic reckoning.
Mm-hmm.
That's all well within the ambit of a pastor, and the Pope is the universal pastor. When you start saying that in order to solve poverty, you should adopt such and such an economic program, now that's something that economists disagree about, just as you pointed out, climate scientists disagree about climate change. So why should the Pope be on one side or the other?
Mm-hmm.
Among other things, it lays the papacy open to the possibility that you'll later be proven wrong.
Yeah, you're creating your own, like a Galileo effect.
Exactly, yeah.
Like almost an unforced error.
Right, and on one you didn't have to make because it's just not in your ambit, within the scope of your authority.
I've been reading you for several years, Philip, back from the Catholic World Report days, and you've never been shy to point out foibles or peccadillos or prudential mistakes that previous pontiffs have made. And you mentioned this in the book, that you're not picking on Pope Francis, that you're weighing in as a journalist to kind of bring clarity and context to some of the things that the Holy Father has done. And it applies to some of the previous pontiffs. Let me touch on a couple of them and see if you agree. That, let's say, start with the interview habit of doing non-authoritative, impromptu remarks that have people a little bit confused. Didn't John Paul II begin this with crossing the threshold of hope? Because I remember there's some of the answers he gave on Buddhism and so on caused a firestorm in Malaysia when he visited there. This book-length, non-authoritative interview almost set the stage for Pope Benedict's interviews with Pete Schewald, which also created some controversy because he's weighing in on things that do have to do with faith and morals, but in a non-authoritative context, which creates a question mark. Is this Catholic teaching, what he said? Does that
That's
make
a good
sense?
point.
There's a bit of a precedent there.
I hadn't thought previously, but you're right. Pope John Paul II did sort of cross that threshold himself. Yeah. Pope Benedict, it's interesting, he was prolific writer. And when he became Pope, he stopped writing so much. I mean, he really hit the brakes hard in terms of his output. And I think that was because he didn't want to confuse the distinction between Ratzinger, the theologian, and Benedict, the vicar of Christ.
Yeah.
And he didn't want to make people think that his theology was sort of official church theology, although we could do worse.
Yeah, that's interesting. Look what he did do. He cranked out tomes that he explicitly said, this is me, I'm doing theology on a speculative level. Don't take this to be papal teaching, with his Jesus of Nazareth series and so on.
Which he thought was one of the most important things that he did as Pope. So that really tells you a lot about his perspective.
He didn't seem to want to be Pope. He famously told John Paul II a couple of times, please not me. I will make use of that crying room before I walk out onto the loggia.
He didn't even want to be prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. He wanted to go home to Germany and write. Mm-hmm.
I want to turn a little bit to the tribunal that was begun under Pope Francis's leadership, much needed, perhaps much overdue, and that is I want to say it was under the wing of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, but to clean up the sex abuse cases and to streamline that process under the leadership of Sean Cardinal O'Malley. What happened under that tribune? What concrete steps were taken to clean up the mess and rid the church of the filth, to use Pope Benedict's phrase?
Well, frankly, it's a mess. I mean, there was the tribunal. There was also the papal commission led by Cardinal O'Malley. They were
That's it.
separate things.
Okay, very good.
And unless I'm mistaken, it was Cardinal O'Malley's commission that recommended the tribunal, and the tribunal was to hold bishops accountable for their failures to address sex abuse properly. And the Pope ratified that. He created the tribunal, and then nothing happened for months. And then he issued another document saying, oh, he wasn't going to create the tribunal. All those problems would be handled through existing procedures through the Congregation for Bishops. So it was a lot of sound and fury and signified nothing. There was no tribunal. We still don't know what will happen to a bishop who is found guilty of neglecting charges of sexual abuse. Several bishops have been encouraged to resign because of that, but there's no sort of official proclamation and no official procedure that gives us a certainty of accountability.
Those reforms were begun in earnest under Benedict XVI, correct? After the long declining health of John Paul II, who apparently was bamboozled by some people like Father Maciel, the leader of the Legionaries of Christ, and that was quickly acted upon once Pope Benedict, maybe he was in the full confidence of his first year, he made decisions that were tough and that were overdue as well. I kind of thought with the announcement of this commission that Pope Francis would take the next step and kind of bring it to the finish line. I'm not sure if that's happened. Are you?
No, it hasn't happened. I mean, the commission last year, there was a good deal of turmoil on the commission. We had a couple of members of the commission resign, saying that it was underfunded, that it didn't meet frequently enough, that other bishops weren't paying attention, that other Vatican offices weren't paying attention, to the point where the commission didn't manage to get a web page up, which, that really doesn't take all that much, as we all know. And that, in fact, Pope Francis hadn't met with the commission at that point. So it clearly was just not given the sort of priority level that you would expect, where someone at the Vatican, preferably the Pope himself or the Secretary of State, says, look, everybody else, you've got to cooperate with this group.
How much influence have people like Cardinal Casper and some of the other Cardinal Marx in Germany? The German church seems to be one of the fastest dying of all countries with their government tax program, where if you're a Catholic in Germany, you have to give this whatever the phrase is in German, the church tax. Their influence seems to be waning and declining, almost as the boomer era leadership that was more in its muscular era in the 60s and 70s seems to have declined. But it also seems to have a residual influence on the current Holy Father. Do you agree with that?
Yes. In fact, I think that the German-speaking bishops have been a very powerful lobby recently. And it makes no sense at all because, as you point out, in the German-speaking world, the Catholic Church is collapsing. The number of people who are leaving, the church greatly exceeds the number who are practicing regularly. And if we're looking for advice on how to make Catholicism more successful, how to evangelize, the last place we should be looking is the German church until they show some signs that they can do it.
How about the Africans?
The African
if you want to look
church,
at a track record for
exactly.
evangelical power and expansion.
And let me just go ahead and say that I see, speaking of the African church, I see some signs of racism in the response that some of the German and other North European bishops and their supporters, the reaction they give to, say, Cardinal Sarah and other African bishops, as if, they don't really know what they're talking about. Well, they do seem to know what they're talking about because they're bringing people into the church.
Yeah, or at least a kind of neo-colonial condescension. Oh, those cute Africans, they've got these weird taboos. We don't really need to pay attention to them. Meanwhile, their own flocks are shrinking.
Right. And there was an example of that at the Synod of Bishops where Cardinal Casper said something about, I don't think we should be listening too much to these African bishops.
Right. Yeah.
And was caught on tape. So
the firing of Cardinal Mueller took me by surprise. I had kind of watched him, not as a regular reader, because I don't think he's put out a lot in English, but Cardinal Mueller was a loyal Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith prefect. He served the church under Benedict XVI, and then was very quickly let go of his position. That was another example of personnel decisions reflecting priorities.
it was also a reflection on the Pope's style, because frankly it was abrupt. I mean, you could almost say it was cruel. He was brought in for a 2-minute conference and told, you're gone. Which is just not the way these things are usually handled at the Vatican, or for that matter anywhere else. And Cardinal Mueller had gone out of his way to be supportive of Pope Francis. He is to this day insisting that Amoris Laetitia is perfectly consistent with prior church teaching. He did not complain, apparently, or at least he didn't complain publicly, when all of his suggestions for amendments on Amoris Laetitia were ignored. So it was very rough treatment. I mean, that's another thing that is a little bit disturbing about this pontificate, is there's something of an enemies list. There seems to be a fairly rigorous, concerted effort to root out dissent in the Curia, an enforcement of loyalty. It is not the accompanying that you hear about so much in the press releases.
By dissent, you don't mean departure from established church teaching in this particular case, right?
I mean
right.
Dissent from Pope Francis, and from what he and his advisors are saying.
Do you think that the norms of Humanae Vitae are next up in the crosshairs of, say, a not too distant future synod? Because I keep reading the same basic premise that the norms of Humanae Vitae are going to be, quote, revisited and kind of soft-pedaled and brought into a modern context because, 50 years ago things were different. I've read different red-hatted men who live in Rome are happy to weigh in to kind of subtract and dilute the force of the teachings of Humanae Vitae. Do you think that's up next?
I don't know if it's up next. I think it's on the agenda. I mean, there could be other things that intervene, but I think that there is a move afoot to reconsider and sort of reinterpret Humanae Vitae. And in a sense, you could say that's what the Synod of Bishops, the 2 meetings of the Synod of Bishops and the subsequent apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, they were a bid to reinterpret Familiaris Consortio. And frankly, I was happy with Familiaris Consortio. I thought it was wonderful as it stood, and similarly with Humanae Vitae. I mean, it's hard to take a stand and say, no, don't touch that, because of course you can always take a fresh look at any document. I'm just worried in the current climate what sort of fresh look it will be.
Mm-hmm. 5 years out, Philip Lawler, how do you define the Francis effect now?
I'm afraid that the most prominent effect after 5 years is confusion. And that's, of course, why I wrote the book. It's the title, I know, is provocative, Lost Shepherd, but I was trying to think through how do you handle a situation where the flock is convinced that the shepherd is leading in the wrong direction. And I feel strongly that all of us have a responsibility to try to make up what we can for the loss of clarity, and to urge others to do the same.
You think the title's a little hard on the Pope, the man, or you're not literally saying he does not know what he's talking about, he's lost, and he's kind of deliberately leading people astray?
No, I don't think he's deliberately leading people astray. I think that it's a question of, does he know which way to go? Mm-hmm. And I think that the confusion that he is generating probably reflects some confusion in his own mind about how he should fulfill his role as universal pastor.
Mm-hmm. He's made some comments in, again, these interviews related to the possibility that he might abdicate. Have you noticed that? I can think
I
of two.
noticed it early on. He said a great deal more. In fact, as I recall, soon after he was elected, he said something about 3 or 4 years and then off to the house of the Father. More recently, I haven't noticed anything along those lines. I mean, he's not a young man, and his health is not wonderful, so I would not expect a long pontificate.
I wanted to ask you about the blessing or the upside of the fact that you wrote the book and the fact that you and I are talking about it. It's generating some interest and readers and so on. Providentially, there's a good side to this, and that is the whole world is talking about the Catholic faith. So for Orthodox, evangelically oriented Catholics, this is an opportunity to clarify things. And
Yes.
you can say the Pope is not a formal heretic. The Pope goes through life, as all popes do, being misquoted, and even if he's not of the German precision character of his predecessor or the rich spiritual depth of John Paul II, he still is a legitimate Pope, and even his perhaps misstatements or his ambiguities give us the opportunity to clarify and to kind of set the record straight. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I'd even go further. I think that earlier I said that we were spoiled by having two wonderful teaching popes. Well, now it's time for us to stand up a little bit. We thought we have sort of perhaps been lulled into thinking, oh, we don't have to worry too much about proclaiming the truths of the faith because the Pope is so good at it. Well, now we're in a situation where I think all of us are called to stand up. I think particularly bishops in their role as teachers are called to stand up and to say clearly what we believe. And I think if enough people are clear about what we as Catholics believe, that will overcome the confusion that we're experiencing now.
And how about the call of the laity? Isn't that one of the signature lines? We were talking earlier about how popes can often be summarized by a single phrase. To me, the single phrase that summarizes the Second Vatican Council is the universal call to holiness.
Yes.
Universal, not just for Father and His Eminence, but you and I and listeners.
And I would say the one phrase that I would take from Vatican II is the age of the laity. And here we are, and it's time to stand up. It's the laity, really, who evangelize. The clergy are in charge of ministering the sacraments and pastoring us while we go out there and mix it up with the secular world and can try to convert it.
Yeah, I like the analogy of the priestly ministry as gas station attendant, and the laity are the drivers who go into the country.
Yes.
We need each other. It's a symbiotic relationship. Philip, briefly, in the few moments we have left, tell us about the Center for Restoration of Culture and what you do there as program director.
Well, we're just getting off the ground this year, and we hope to be up to speed by the next school year. And the idea is to be based geographically focused in New England and trying to define the terms of debate, or trying to influence the terms of debate in a very liberal secular region.
Yeah.
And insert some idea of classic Christian culture and appreciation of Christian culture back into that conversation.
The website is restorationchristianculture.org, centered. It's Merrimack, right? Thomas More College?
That's right.
All right. And co-led in some way by my friend, Dr. Anthony Esselin?
That's right. He was instrumental to getting it off the ground as well. He's a man who sort of embodies what you're talking about when you think of Christian culture.
Sure. And robust, salient, lay apostolic zeal and articulation. I'm a big fan of his writing, too. Well, thanks for writing the book, Philip. It was courageous. I'm glad you imbue the whole thing with a love of the Holy Father, and just want to echo the call to pray for all of our bishops and priests and religious who are under special attack today. It's a different ballgame. This is not 1952. The ghetto's long, long gone, and so it's kind of a Wild West. So I think your book is welcome, and I think you hit the right tone. And we'll talk about the Center for Restoration of Christian Culture once you get up and on 2 feet. Fair enough?
That sounds great. Thank you.
All right, very good. At patrickcoffin.media, you can see the show notes, a link to the book, and also to this Center for Restoration of Christian Culture website. Much else besides. Philip Lawler, thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, this is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?